And if you maybe have seen this in the news, recently in Iceland, they organized a funeral for the first big glacier of Iceland, which was distinctive. So the other things in the other ecosystems, the most important point is down here, and this is also a kind of preoccupation which you can sometimes hear, that people believe, well, if it's getting warmer, I mean, warming in Taiwan is maybe a bit different, but in the alpine regions a bit warmer is fine, because then you grow vines everywhere in the Alps, and then in the southern part of Europe you start producing bananas and so on. Yeah. So what is the problem? But the real problem is that the extreme weather events are more frequent and more intense. And this is where the damages are coming from. And this is very important that we respect this situation. And then there is another phenomenon called tipping points. To give a very blunt definition or explanation what tipping points are, so this is nothing else. You stay on the clip and you make a step further and you can't come back anymore. These are tipping points. Tipping points is that a reversal of certain natural situations take place, and they cannot reverse, even not if you would be able to reduce afterwards the degree, the warming of our climate. And there are many of these tipping points. Not all of them are starting at the same point, at the same level of warming, but the more warming, the more tipping points. And another typical example is the extinction of plant varieties and plant species. So with the experts tell us that with a warming of roughly 3 degrees Celsius, we must expect the extinction of almost 1/3 of all the plant species on the globe. So you see that we are not dealing with nitty-gritties here, we are dealing with fundamental problems. And as I mentioned, last month, the IPCC experts went together in Geneva, because they are based in Geneva, and they presented a new report dealing with climate change and land use. And this is the area where we would like then to go a bit deeper. So where are we? We are near to 1% increase over land at the moment. And they discussed these bars. So this water scarcity, soil erosion, vegetation losses, wildfire damage, permafrost degradation, tropical crop yield decline, and food supply instabilities. And you can see that the yellow and the red and dark red, violet color starts not everywhere at the same level. So this means that these different things are differently sensitive to global warming. But unfortunately, you see that on the right end, the food supply instabilities, they start first. Just to give you a few examples what this means in the end. Here you can see the water scarcity problem. The biggest concern is here about Australia, where the frequency of droughts is growing rapidly, and also the intensity, as you can see here, is enormous. And another thing is soil erosion. The problem we are facing is that on all the arable land on the globe, the erosion is growing because the soil, the humus content in the soil is everywhere below the natural level. The natural level would be 2%, but it's even everywhere much less. And this creates this soil erosion. Also, if you don't use the traditional method of tillage, you don't use the plow anymore, but even then there is a huge difficulty because, as you can see here, if you conventionally till your fields, then the erosion is 100 times higher than the soil formation. So, and therefore you lose year by year a lot of biological material in the soils. Vegetation losses, there is an ongoing discussion, especially in Brazil at the moment, because the new president of Brazil decided to allow again the deforestation of the Amazonas rainforests, and this is also with enormous, accompanied by enormous consequences, and you can see that Brazilian scientists say in the meantime that it is accelerating towards a tipping point also. So a similar thing is with the wildfires. The wildfires are also more frequent and more intense. For example, the wildfires in the northern part of Europe and especially in the north of Russia, close to the ice sea, they had this year, and there was an area burning which was as big as Taiwan, the whole Taiwan. And the clouds from the smoke of these fires covered an area which is almost half of the whole area of the European Union. The next is the permafrost degradation. This is, as you know, in the very north, near the Arctic zone, you have many permafrost soils, and if the permafrost soils are thawing, then in these soils is a lot of methane, which is one of the fossil gases stored, and this goes up then in the atmospheres and produces a lot of damage. And finally, the tropical crop yield decline. This is not only based on this global warming. It has also to do with other factors which are not so well known for the moment. So to understand better what is going on in the tropical areas, it will be necessary that a lot more of research would be done. But what we know for sure is that it's getting worse. So, and now we are on this last bar, the food supply instabilities. And this is where we start to discuss a little bit what this means. So in our agriculture, what we can observe already is a growing alternance. Alternance means that you have 1 year with a rather good harvest and in the following year you have then a bad harvest. This is more often the case everywhere. And then you have the increase of the weather disasters, so you have more floods, you have more droughts, you have more storms, and all these phenomena lead to lower or bad harvests. And then another effect is that, for example, in the more moderate zones, climate zones in the world, you find more and more pests and more diseases which were unknown in the past in these areas. So they are imported from other parts of the world and create new problems which were not known. And clearly these effects have then also an influence on the economy of the agricultural sector. We find more price volatility, which means that there are spontaneous ups and downs in the world market prices of certain commodities. And this again leads to a growing commodity speculation, because it's always interesting for the finance industry to speculate on unsecure markets. But unfortunately, it has also the consequence that again hunger and malnutrition is growing instead of decreasing. We had years in the past where we had a substantial decrease. This was also after the Millennium Goals were decided in the UN. But now we have the SDGs, which you all know. And within these SDGs, it is foreseen that hunger should be eradicated until 2030, which means more or less in the next 10 years. But the reality is that there's no further reduction of the number of hungry people. The reality is that this figure is growing again. At the moment, we have roughly 820 million people on this globe which are either starving hunger or which are facing malnutrition. So, action is urgent and action is absolutely necessary. And this was the reasoning why the international community accepted if we should act, we need a new international agreement. And this is the so-called Paris Agreement, where the heads of states and governments decided to keep the global warming below the 2 degrees Celsius, or also to do the utmost to keep them within this 1.5 grad Celsius limits. And based on that, it is clearly the way out that we have to reduce the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, which is primarily the CO2 emissions, until mid of this century. And all countries must contribute to that, but a new implementation method was introduced. There was no decision on specific measures. The idea was that the countries which signed up this agreement come forward with their own proposals, what they would be prepared to do to achieve these goals. And you can see here where we are with this kind of policy. Under the current policy, if we don't do more, we must expect a warming of 3.3 grad Celsius. But if we only introduce those measures which were decided by the signatory countries, then we still end up with 3 degrees Celsius. So the level of ambition at the moment is not big enough. We must increase our efforts to achieve what we should achieve, the 1.5 or 2 degrees.